I'm Scott Schiff with William Swig, and this is the Ayn Rand Fan Club. William, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good, good. Well, we're pleased to have a true legend in the history of objectivism and more broadly Ayn Rand fandom with us. Andrew Bernstein, author of many books, most recently Heroes, Legends, Champions, Why Heroism Matters. He's a philosopher with a PhD from City University of New York. He's written novels. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's good to be here, Scott and William. Thanks for having me on.
Great, great. I have a bit of a personal anecdote I was going to use to break the ice. I'm sure you wouldn't remember meeting me 25 years ago at a local objectivist conference in Tampa. I cringe when I think of this, but I actually saw you in a restroom, and I immediately cooked up some question on the spot about the fountainhead. As inappropriate as that was of me, you were very nice about it, answered my question before going back to the event. It's one of the most positive interactions I've had with a big-time objectivist, so I always appreciated your basic demeanor.
Well, you're certainly welcome, Scott. You reminded me, do you remember that anecdote that they told about Churchill after he lost the election after the war to Clement Attlee, the socialist, and they met in the men's room at Parliament, and Clement Attlee, the socialist, said to Churchill something like, "What's the matter, Winnie? You're not looking." They're standing at the urinal. "What's the matter, Winnie? And you're not looking so good today." And Churchill said, "No, it's just that with you socialists, when you see something that's big and in working order, you want to nationalize it." So
That's great.
Well, Churchill had that sense of humor. I hope that's not too crude for the show.
Oh, you'll probably be reining us in before it's over.
Okay. All right. Very, very cool.
I want to say, and one of the reasons we wanted to have you on is, I think you've kind of been the main ARI, even affiliated intellectual that has recognized the left as more of a threat than the right. I mean, you've been brave against the left for saying that. And frankly, I think you've been brave to state your case clearly to some objectivists who are they see both sides as morally equivalent.
Yeah, thank you. I don't get it. It's puzzling to me that, and these are longtime friends and colleagues of mine. So I'm not gonna criticize anybody personally. Just be a rational human being. Honest human beings could disagree rationally about these issues, right? Rational human beings could disagree honestly, but I don't get it. The left has become so nihilistic that by contrast, Trump looks like Trump is a flawed case without a doubt. But by contrast to the leftists and to the Democrats, I mean he's like George Washington by comparison.
Right.
I mean, you can go off on one issue after another. The endless lying about man-made, warming. This brazen lying that white supremacy is a terrible threat to the country, when the truth is white supremacy has been dying. It's evil and it's still around, but it's been dying since the heyday of the civil rights movement, some 50 odd years ago. The endless push towards socialism and anti-capitalism, the racism of the left today. It's like, it reminds me, guys, on the Hero show the other day, a couple of weeks ago, we did John Hersey and I did the romance of Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett. And Elizabeth Barrett's immortal, love poem in Sonnets from the Portuguese that everybody knows where she begins. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. Well, like with the leftists today, you can paraphrase it. How am I a racist? Let me count the ways. Well, let's see. We demonize whites. Our policies kill blacks by the thousands. We discriminate against Asians on college admission standards, and eternally we hate Jews. So I mean, the left is off the charts evil, and they have to be stopped.
Absolutely. And I think that inspired you announcing some news this week that you plan to speak at the Republican Liberty Caucus at their national convention. I think in 2023, which is actually the bigger year because that's when all the presidential candidates will be around and trying to make their case.
Yeah, well, that's not set in stone. I hope to. Mike Franco, is an objectivist buddy of mine in Missouri, said let's make this happen. Are you up for it if we can make this happen? I said definitely. So I hope that's the case, because we know the Republicans and the religious conservatives are very flawed, but they're not nearly as bad as the leftists. Right now, given what the Democratic Party is, it's hopeless to try and reason with them about reason, individual rights, and personal liberties and everything. I don't think it's hopeless yet with the Republicans and the religious conservatives. So I hope to be able to speak to them and really try to fire them up with themes from Atlas Shrugged and stand up for individual rights and for the principles this country was founded on. There's still that element in the Republican Party that's long gone in the Democrats.
It's easy to sit on the sidelines and just say, oh, well, they're not perfect, or they have, an altruist element. And but I mean, in some ways, it makes more sense to at least get in there, try to make the case. Like you said, you want to speak to fan support for individualism and individual rights and capitalism. And, I mean, that's how you actually start moving the ball in our direction.
Yeah, the Republicans, I think, we get into the philosophy here, guys. Well, we're Ayn Rand fans. So, Ayn Rand, in my judgment, greatest novelist in world literature and the greatest philosopher since Aristotle. And so getting into the philosophy here is very appropriate. I think there's two reasons why the Republicans, the religious conservatives are less bad. And I won't glorify them by saying better, because we're talking about, the lesser of two evils here, but they're less bad, and I think they're less bad by a lot. One is that Christianity is the dominant religion of the the religious conservatives, the way Marxism is of the leftists and the Democrats. And I wrote a whole essay, published an essay a few months ago that Christianity is less evil than Marxism, and part the main reason for that is that Christianity, despite in any religion, is faith-based, and it anathematizes reason, or at least subordinates reason to faith. But in Christianity in particular, there's this glorification of the personal soul, that your soul is yours, it's individualistic, and it's precious, and it's sacred, and the most important thing for you to do is to save your soul. In college, I had a friend, and I was an objectivist by then. He was a really good guy, but a devout Christian. And he said, Andy, a serious Christian will sacrifice anything. We'll sacrifice our money, our clothes, our house, anything, except one thing we will never sacrifice, and that is our hopes for salvation. And then, it's faith-based, but there's still that last element of individualism.
Yeah, it's their salvation.
Exactly. It's egoistic. And notice, guys, since we're Ayn Rand fans, notice that no less of a leftist than Ellsworth Toohey himself in The Fountainhead, in his backstory there, when he's full sessions lasting till dawn, Ayn Rand said when he was a student at Harvard, he's excoriating Christianity because it's selfish. And he's absolutely right. It is selfish in that sense. And there too, he is giving voice to a long-standing Marxist criticism of Christianity. And leave their assessment aside, the factual claim is accurate. Christianity is grounded in selfishness in that sense, and in your personal soul and in individualism. Now, it's there. On the other hand, the leftists, and here I include the National Socialists. And by the way, I use the term National Socialism always to remind people that the Nazis are socialists, and they are. Guys, I'm sorry, I'm going off on a rant here.
Go ahead.
Thank you. If those spatial metaphors, left and right, are to have any rational meaning, then left means collectivism and socialism, and right means individualism and capitalism. Otherwise, these terms have no applicability. I advise my logic students then just drop the metaphors and speak of collectivism and socialism, individualism and capitalism. And the National Socialists, they are as collectivist as anybody could possibly be. The leftists, whether the Nazis or the communists, they do everything they possibly can to annihilate, eradicate, extirpate. I sound like Jesse Jackson here. You know, we can annihilate, eradicate, extirpate. You know, but they do everything they possibly can to wipe out individuality. There's that line from the Khmer Rouge, you know, the Cambodian communists,
Right.
victims. That,
Killing fields.
Yeah, right, exactly. What is it? Losing you, quote, losing you is no loss, keeping you is no specific gain, unquote. Now there it is. There's the theme of collectivism, a full-blown collectivism, whether communist or National Socialist. The individual is nothing. The state is everything. Now, the Democratic Party are not yet full collectivists, and the Republicans certainly aren't full individualists. But there's their two philosophies, Christianity and Marxism, and one is much less bad than the other. And I don't, you know, and I don't see any way to escape that conclusion. So that's one reason.
I mean, I agree with you about National Socialists being collectivists, but in my own study of history, I've come to see that at least they, you know, in many cases were former socialists like Mussolini, who saw that there was a good gig in actually fighting the socialists. And there were so many people in both Italy and Germany that were scared after the Russian Revolution that in some ways they wanted a strong man to stop socialism, and that was part of fascism and why it ultimately won, if only by default, before World War II.
Yes, that's certainly true, but it was the version of socialism that they were afraid of was specifically Marxism, the communism, and the communists. Right. The communists, like you said, they had conquered Russia, established the Soviet Union, and it was brutal. It was a brutal bloodbath. So you can understand why people were afraid of communism. But and Mussolini's father was a hardcore Marxist and one of the founders of the Italian Communist Party. And Mussolini was, you know, a leader of the Italian Communist Party. And fascism and National Socialism is just a variation on the theme. I think of it,
right.
You know, communism is class war socialism. National Socialism is race war socialism. There's certain differences between the two, but the fundamental, of course, is that your life does not belong to you. Your life belongs to the state. That's the leitmotif that runs through full-blown collectivism of both variants. So what did Ayn Rand say about that? The difference between them is that under one system, the head butcher wears red shirts, and under the other system, the head butcher wears brown shirts. That's nicely put.
One of the Austrian economists also said that they were both recruiting from the same group of thugs.
Right. That's right. And there was a lot of cross-pollination, you know, certainly in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s, as Hitler's thugs were rising in power. People went back and forth from, you know, Marxism or communism on the one hand to National Socialism on the other, because they share the fundamentals, you know, about, again, you know, under individualism, the Lockean, Jeffersonian philosophy, your life belongs to you. Whereas under any form of collectivism, and those two major ones are variants of Hegel's influence in Germany and in Europe more broadly, your life belongs to the state, and that's the main thing they have in common.
Yeah, I mean, my concern is that we're at the point where, you know, very few people are standing up to the left, and people are getting scared, and then that's what, you know, leaves the potential for some authoritarian answer. Not that Trump was that, even though he was accused of that, but, you know, that someone in the future will come along when the disastrous results of these leftist policies, take hold.
Well, I think that's very real fear, guys. And right now, given the differences between the two parties, that political strongman authoritarian type is most likely to come from the left. Tom Perez said a couple of years ago that AOC was the future of the Democratic Party. Unfortunately, I think that's true.
Right.
Because the Democratic Party has been taken over by the Bernie Sanders mentality. Now, even Bernie Sanders isn't yet a communist. Even Bernie Sanders isn't calling for nationalization of industries and the abolition of private property. But I do think they're trending in that direction. And, within 10 or 20 years, I think they will be, calling for those things. They will be on the cusp of communism. Now, Bernie Sanders at 80 years old can't be the future of that party. But AOC, who's a clone, an ideological clone of Bernie Sanders, what is she, in her early 30s?
Yeah.
She's young. So she could be around, for 50 years. And I could see her as the future of the Democratic Party. And she was the face of the Democratic Party. She was, after the election, she was calling for lists, of political enemies. And
I have your quote from that. It was an amazing Facebook post back in November. You wrote in response to calling for lists that I want you to know that by every peaceful means possible, I will fight your racist, socialist, environmentalist program with all my mind, all my heart, and all my energy. And in the long run, you will lose. America will not become the socialist state of your nightmare vision. So please, I beg you, put me at the top of your archived list, secondarily as a Trump supporter, but primarily as an American patriot who will fight your racist, socialist environment programs now and forever in the name of American liberty. That is such a bold attitude. And my question is, why aren't we hearing more of that from more people in the liberty movement?
Guys, I wish I knew the answer to that. I'm dismayed by it. Again, there's a lot of objectivists and libertarians. They're people who are friends of mine, they're colleagues of mine. I respect their work. Why they're not standing up more against the leftists and the Democrats, I don't know. Why they spend so much energy criticizing Trump, who was the lesser evil here, and less energy criticizing, Bernie Sanders and AOC and these people. I don't know. I don't know, but I do know that the left is dangerous. And you know what? It didn't take much courage for me to write that, because once they established gulags, I'm gone anyway. The author of the Capitalist Manifesto is going to get dragged off, to a gulag. So that's not funny.
The truth is, standing up that boldly is probably your best defense, counterintuitively.
Yes.
Because
yes,
they're looking for people that are wishy-washy that they can basically intimidate into submitting.
Right. Absolutely right. And also, when you stand up boldly like that, there's the hope that rational human beings will hear you and join you in the fight for liberty, and recognize how un-American and anti-American it is to be calling for lists. She said something like, shortly after the election, that she wanted some congressional committee to oversee misinformation on social media. One of the newly elected members of the Democratic National Committee said, I don't remember his name offhand, but he was from California, said something like, we Democrats need to be thinking in terms of post-World War II Germany and Japan, when they did the denazification programs in Germany to basically re-educate Republicans. They're talking openly. That was an open call from a DNC member for re-education camps, for Republican voters and Trump supporters. I mean, it's unconscionable. It's so anti-American. I'm shocked that there's a more backlash against this.
Misinformation basically means, premises held by those that don't agree with the progressive agenda.
Exactly. Misinformation to AOC and her ilk means anybody who critiques the leftist orthodoxy. So that's, to me, that is the single worst danger here. And it comes from the leftists, not from the religious conservatives, or sometimes from the religious conservatives, but not nearly to the degree. And that is the attack on freedom of speech, the attack on the First Amendment. The left stands for cancel culture, and they will do everything they possibly can to muzzle you. If you critique the leftist orthodoxy, they will do everything they possibly can to muzzle you, silence you, cancel you, and that's moving towards government censorship when members of Congress are calling for lists and congressional oversight of misinformation on social media. It's terrifying. It's so utterly anti-American. And what really terrifies me, like you guys said, is how little backlash there's been against it, including especially from prominent members of the liberty movement.
Yeah, I mean, I've gotten to the point with other lefties that claim to be moderate of saying, look, you tell your crazies to stand down and then we'll do the same to ours. And they won't do that. They get backed into a corner. They kind of know that they would be threatened too as not being woke enough, and they lash out. I think they usually were calling me a victim or something.
Yeah, the left will eat its own. The people who are less woke will get eaten by the more woke, and it's already happening. Bill Maher, for example, has had the audacity to speak out against wokeness and cancel culture and in support of Israel and things like that. He's been harshly criticized by various leftists. Yeah, when they come to power, I do think within 10 or 20 years, if the present trends are not reversed, I do think they're going to be calling for and maybe even establishing re-education camps for their political foes. I do.
It's already happening in corporations.
Yeah, it's amazing how many people have been fired who was that one guy who was the radio voice of the Sacramento Kings NBA team for many years, got fired over the Black Lives Matter issue when he said all lives matter. He got fired for saying all lives matter on the radio. I mean, can you imagine?
I remember every Democrat candidate in 2016 getting in trouble for saying all lives matter. And that's where they were lectured and, it was hammered in that that's not acceptable language.
Wow. Yeah, it's horrible. So right now it's largely still private. There aren't any government censoring agencies like AOC wants. But for a member of Congress is obviously powerful. And when she called for that oversight on misinformation on social media, and she's not the only one, they're calling for, like I said, DNC members are calling for basically re-education camps. Then we're into the government initiation of force against us. That is a huge step towards totalitarianism. That's what I fear the most. And it doesn't come from the religious conservatives as much. They want to use government force to force social media companies to give vent to let conservative voices be spoken, be heard on social media and everything, which is a violation, I think, of government power. But it's not nearly to the degree that the leftists are. So that the leftists are much worse, on the free speech issue.
Andy, I think that this hostility to free speech coming from the left is deeply psychological in nature. It comes from a problem they have with coping with reality, and so they kind of have this negative reaction to reality itself, and that includes speech. So when someone starts talking about things that they disagree with, they can't handle it. So they have to basically crush your speech in order to cope with their evasions of reality.
That's a good point, William. It's like, I think Ayn Rand would certainly agree with you about that. I think it's true. They're like villains out of Atlas Shrugged. Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, all right. Okay, good. Yeah, I can hear you.
They use tactics like ad hominems and straw men, and it just gets its relentless assault on reason and logic. They just come at you with, all the negative ways of arguing.
Right, and I understand your point about defying reality and then being enormously defensive about people who stand up for reality. I mean, they've gotten so crazy to the point where if I identify as female, I could be any gender I want to be, and It's not a matter of biological reality. It's a matter of choice. I could and different leftists. How many different genders are there? I mean, some say 7, some say some.
I think it's approaching infinity right now.
This cisgender, transgender.
Trying to put a specific number on it is too cis-normative.
It's, I mean, it's just crazy. And, you know, it's complete in Ayn Rand's terms, utter primacy of consciousness mentality that, you know, reality is malleable. Reality can be, you know, molded to our whims or desires. And it has real tragic consequences too, because now a man who identifies as a woman can now compete in women's sports. And the injustice of that, you know, and I wouldn't need to have an 18-year-old daughter who I was very glad played high school volleyball, you know, because I love sports. But, you know, you're playing volleyball and his, you know, so, and a lot of these women athletes are, you know, they're really good. They're really dedicated. They work hard. They become great players in basketball or volleyball or soccer, you know, or whatever it is, track and field. And now let's say, you know, let's just say Nancy as a, you know, just a generic female name. Nancy's a great athlete. Let's say she's really worked hard. She's 5'4", she weighs 115 pounds. And now she has to compete, you know, in basketball, let's say against somebody who's 6 foot, weighs 180 pounds. You know, the injustice of this, you know, for men who identify as women, I feel for them. It's got to be painful if if your emotional life is at odds with your biological reality. That's got to be a painful way to live, and I feel for them. But they don't stop being male just because they feel that way, or I empathize with them. And if they want to play sports, I'm all in favor of it. But they're men, and they should compete against men. And the left is they've lost their freaking mind.
I've become convinced that they're more interested in calling us bigots than trying to help us understand where they're coming from.
Yeah. They can't help us understand where they're coming from because they don't know.
Right. It's basically just a bludgeon to hold over us.
Thoughts for them are a mystery. It's a social construct that anyone can come up with. So I mean, every lefty is going to have a different reason for why they say something.
Yeah, you could see the you know, as a philosopher and as an objectivist philosopher, I could see the influence of Kant and Hegel here. You know, Kant, of course, the idea that the human mind constructs reality, and the human mind all functions the same way, regardless of gender or race or nationality or time period or anything. And then Hegel broke up that monolith, you know, no, different nationalities or different time periods, the basic concepts or the basic beliefs by means of which human beings structure reality, you know, that they're changed, they're altered. And here we see that, you know, Hegel's influence here, that different groups have different means of understanding reality, and there's no one truth, there's no one reality. Different groups will perceive it differently. There's male truth and there's female truth, and there's heterosexual truth, and there's homosexual truth, and so on and on and on. In reality, the key point here is reality is a social construct. And so if society believes that biological males are women, then by God, they're women. And it really is what Ayn Rand called the primacy of consciousness mentality, specifically in its social, not in its religious version. Society is now God. And if enough people believe X, therefore X, regardless of what objective reality is. You know,
well, society is gone, and I think they're getting rid of reality as well, because I heard this theory called the Plural Verse. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but there's this guy who he gave a TED talk on the Plural Verse, and I watched it on YouTube. And this idea is essentially there's no objective reality at all, and all cultures come up with their own view of like what exists, and then that's true for every culture. Their view of the world is true for them. And
Right.
so that's why there's all these plural verses, and there's no one real objective reality.
Right. And that's pure warmed over Hegel. With, I don't know whether this guy realizes it or not, but what gets really drives home the terrifying, consequences of that is that that's true not just cognitively, but then it has to be true morally. Every pluriverse has its own morality. And I remember years ago, 1980s, I was a young kid in grad school. I was teaching at C.W. Post Center, Long Island University, out on Long Island, ritzy area, very upscale. A lot of Jews living there, doctors and accountants and scientists and stuff. And so one kid in class was putting forth exactly this idea, that every culture has its own truth, every culture has its own morality. And I said to him, well, okay, we'll look at the consequences of that. And I said, that makes it, because this was a Jewish kid. I said that makes it, more in National Socialist Germany, if society wanted to annihilate the Jews, then that's morally right for them, right? He didn't bat an eye. He said yes. I said,
Jeez,
wow. Wow. I said, well, I disagree. I think human life is sacred, and murdering an innocent person is morally wrong across all plural verses. That I didn't have that term back in the 1980s, but across all cultures. But yeah, there's a subjectivism. That kind of subjectivism has been rampant for a long time, and it's completely taken over the Democratic Party now. The leftists are they're really profoundly subjectivist and completely on that, what Ayn Rand called that social version of the primacy of consciousness mentality. Right? The will of the people is the will of God. And
how do you think we compartmentalize that belief in thinking that it's okay for the Nazis to kill all the Jews, and then it's also okay for me to be against that? It's like, how do they compartmentalize that ethical system?
yeah, that's a good question. It's completely subjectivist. And it goes all the way back to classical Greece, probably further than that. But the Greeks, of course, codified a lot of these theories into formal philosophy. This was the Sophists. And Thrasymachus, who's a major character in the early books of Plato's Republic, is the idea that the Sophists were a band of traveling educators in classical Greece that Socrates and Plato had particular antipathy towards.
Right. They wrote that they could be paid to change their opinion or something.
Yeah, right. That they were teachers for hire. That was one thing Plato, the aristocrat, had against them. He said, you're making knowledge dissemination into a money-making activity. Shame on you. But the Sophists were subjectivists, and and especially Thrasymachus, who was one of the extreme versions of it. Their idea was that ultimately, everybody has their own opinion. The truth will vary not only from society to society, but even more radically from individual to individual within society. Everybody has their own truth. When we have clashing viewpoints that can't be adjudicated, then we fight. We struggle, and the ultimate arbiter of human disagreement is force. That's the viewpoint that we're dealing with here. It's not that the Nazis were wrong on this viewpoint, is that they were weak. I mean, relative to their enemies, they couldn't defeat their enemies. So if the Nazis won, then they lost. So they're victors. What did Churchill say with a different meaning? That history is written by the victors.
Right.
But from this subjectivist standpoint, truth then is determined by the victors. The philosophy, the religion, the moral code of the victors is the truth. And if the other guys won, then their philosophy would be the truth. But the ultimate arbiter of human disagreement is force. That was the Sophist belief, and it's very prevalent amongst the people we're talking about right now.
Seems to me that moral agnosticism has something to do with it. If you believe that any moral system could be true, then you wouldn't have a problem with other systems. You'd say, well, that might be right. But I think it's a little different when you say both are right. it's right for them and then mine's right for me. That's something different, right?
Uh, there might be, yeah, there might be some, there might be some difference there, but what they have in common, of course, is the rejection of the idea that there is such a thing as an objective basis for morality. There's such a thing as a factual base for moral judgments and for right and wrong. So for us, as individualists and believing in the sacredness of individual life and the moral necessity to ban the initiation of force, and respect the rights of each individual to live as he will, so long as he's not initiating force or fraud, to these kinds of these different mentalities, that makes us dogmatic, even authoritarian. We're dangerous because we believe that there's an objective basis of morality, and that there's only as a short step from there, our enemies will say, to ramming it down everybody else's throat. Whereas the truth is, an objective basis to morality shows, as Ayn Rand demonstrated, that the sacredness of that each individual's life is precious and is wrong to initiate force. That the dangers here come from the other side. That there's no such thing as moral truth other than what I feel or what I believe.
Right.
Because if I believe that I have the right to smash you over there with a club, kill you and steal everything you own, then that's right for me. Well, there's where the real danger comes in morality. The idea that truth is subjective, that moral truth is subjective, it's dangerous. And give Socrates and Plato credit; they recognize that. Plato's answer to it was almost, was maybe worse than his cure was almost worse than the disease, but he recognized the horrors of that kind of subjectivism in cognition and in ethics.
Yeah, I always wondered if Socrates's forced death by the Athenian rulers played a role in Plato just thinking, oh, to hell with these guys, let's just put the philosophers in charge of everything.
Well, I think it definitely played a role. You can see it in the allegory of the cave. It's really, at one level, it's the story of Socrates. But remember, Plato's what really drives the Platonic system is the theory of forms. Because and here's the dangers of a supernatural metaphysics, whether it's in a philosopher like Plato or whether it's in faith-based religion. Once you believe that true reality, real reality, the degrees of reality, right? We could call the world of forms an intellectual heaven for sure. Once you believe that that's the source of truth, you're necessarily, I think, logically on the path to political elitism, because most people cannot spend their lives studying the higher world. They have a living to make. They have to feed their kids. They have to earn a living. It's the few, the philosophers will study the world of forms. The theologians will study God and heaven. Well, they know the truth. And if man's law, the law of the land, is then going to be in harmony with God's law, the law of the higher world, it follows logically that the clergy and or the philosophers must have total political authority. And so once you have a supernatural metaphysics, the logic of that leads inevitably to to theocratic dictatorship. And Plato's caught in that. He's not a theocrat. He's not faith-based. He's a philosopher. He's claiming to go by reason, but he's projected reason to a higher world, and that necessarily cuts off every man and every woman from it. The philosophers in his case and the theologians in religion's case have to rule. The logic of it is, I think, is unimpeachable.
Yeah, that makes sense. What you said about the intellectuals, I mean, because again, there have been intellectuals in the liberty movement that have not been reality-based enough for my liking, where they've still kind of had their own elitism. There's this Rand quote that I think relates. She says, and I'm sure you've heard this, the truly and deliberately evil men are a very small minority. It is the appeaser who unleashes them on mankind. It is the appeaser's intellectual abdication that invites them to take over. When a cultural's dominant trend is geared to irrationality, the thugs win over the appeasers. When intellectual leaders fail to foster the best in the mixed, unformed, vacillating character of people at large, the thugs are sure to bring out the worst. When the ablest men turn into cowards, the average men turn into brutes.
Well,
And to me, I mean, she's almost saying that it's the intellectuals crying both sides and not standing up to the postmodernists more forcefully. They're actually exacerbating the anger of regular common sense people.
Yeah, that is deep. Yeah, again, I think we're talking about the horrors coming from modernist philosophy. You know, the major philosophy of the conservatives, of course, is religion, Christianity. But the political left is their philosophy is they're basically Germans. You know, what I think of as the unholy triumvirate, Kant, Hegel, and Marx.
Right.
Their philosophy dominates the intellectual culture, and their political party is the Democrats. And so, you know, who's more irrational? Who's more authoritarian? And I think the answer to that is the German philosophy is worse than Christianity, which is why I published that essay on the left is more evil than Christianity. That it's really it reminds me, guys, of when Obama was president. I'd be around Obama supporters, and I would say I loathed Obama, and the initial response almost always was, "Why? Because he's black." This is the way leftists, I won't even say they think, they feel. It's everything's about race. I said, no, not because he's black, because he's red. And I said, what? I said, he's a Marxist. That's why I'd vote for Thomas Sowell for president in a heartbeat if he ever wanted to. If he at 91 years old, I'd vote for Thomas Sowell, right now for president. But anyhow, the German philosophy, the philosophy which gave us politically National Socialism and Communism, is worse. And Ayn Rand's right. In our day, the intellectuals haven't stood up, as you put it, against the insanities of postmodernism. The idea again that there is no objective truth, that every group, every race, either gender, has their own reality. There's no dictionary of translation. There's no way to communicate back and forth. Ultimately, we just have these competing visions, and ultimately we just fight. And the stronger wins and the weaker loses. The intellectuals haven't done a good enough job against that. And coming right to our own day and narrowing it to politics, as we said at the outset, the intellectual leaders of the liberty movement are not doing enough. I hope that changes. In the near future, they're not doing enough to stand up to the left. And just the insanity, the vicious insanity of their and especially the authoritarianism, the cancel culture. Shut up anybody who disagrees with you. It's not doing nearly enough.
You're just reminding me of what Mark Stein said, back with Charlie Hebdo. If all the newspapers had the courage to show the Muhammad cartoons, the terrorists wouldn't have been able to target all of them.
Right.
It's everyone's moral cowardice puts the people on the front lines in danger.
Yeah, well, we're at war. The jihadists are at war with us. That's obvious because they're killing people, and the leftists are at war with us also. And so that truth sometimes is scary, and if you tell the newspapers, hire armed guards, retired Navy SEALs, let's say, for 24/7 protection, they'll respond, they'll object. Well, aside from that's expensive. They'll say, "Well, I don't want to live in a war zone or in this combat situation." And you don't want to be at war. What does Aragorn say in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy? War is upon you. He says to Theoden,
whether you acknowledge it or not.
Yeah, war is upon you, whether you acknowledge it or not, and you need to stand up to these guys. Freedom of speech is at stake. You need to stand up as a newspaper, you need to stand up to the jihadists and print these pictures of Muhammad. If you need to hire, armed guards to protect you from them, so be it. But moral cowardice is not going to enable us to defend ourselves against the bad guys. So yeah, there's a lot of that, and I wonder if I hate to say this, but I wonder if leaders of the liberty movement, if they're afraid of the left, and that's why they don't stand up. It's easy to criticize the Republicans because they're going to do little or nothing to you, but to criticize the Democrats who want to cancel you, that takes more courage. Reminds me of so many Europeans, they're willing to criticize the hell out of Israel. Israel's no threat to them, but they won't criticize the Palestinians, or the jihadists, because they are.
Right.
I think the liberty movement, in general, I guess I could talk about it in general, but maybe it'd be better to talk about just like more atheistic libertarian movement members. I think they see the religiosity of the right as like the major threat. And there might be something to that argument, but
they're ignoring the religion of the left.
But I think that what they're ignoring is all the religiosity, including the Christians on the left, because there are Christians on the left. There's definitely Christian Democrats, and they have the more radical sort of altruistic beliefs that you see coming from like Southern Baptists or, really hardcore Christians who believe that you have a piece of God in your soul, Jesus lives in your heart, and they turn Christianity into its collectivistic form.
Yeah. I'm reminded here, one of my heroes is Leonard Peikoff. There's nobody alive who I think has done more to advance objectivism than he has. He's brilliant writer and philosopher, lecturer. And in the dim hypothesis, if I remember correctly, he concludes the United States is moving towards a dictatorship, and specifically of a religious kind. And if that's, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but if that's Dr. Peikoff's conclusion, then I respectfully disagree. I think we're definitely moving towards dictatorship, but I think, to me, it seems clear it's coming from the secular, atheistic left much more than from the religious conservative.
I think he sees that. I think that's what his vote for Trump was trying to tell us.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Leonard Peikoff is a very rational guy. He's very evidence-based. I mean, he said publicly that he voted for Trump. He's definitely saying that the left represents more of a danger. But, Ayn Rand taught us brilliantly in The Fountainhead, independence is a virtue. And so you look at reality, right? Leonard Peikoff put it very nicely in Old Par that independence is a primary orientation towards reality, not towards other people. So looking at reality, looking at for the evidence, because I'll change my mind if I'm wrong. It's more, it's more important to get at the truth than to be right. And
Sure.
And so I'm looking for the evidence that the religious conservatives are more dangerous to freedom than the left. And what is the case that can be made for that conclusion?
Well, I've heard some objectivists they've kind of taken the dim hypothesis to mean that Democrats are nihilists and therefore they can't take over, and therefore the threat has to come from the right. But again, I mean, my theory is that it comes from no one standing up to the left for so long, and they're so busy waiting for this threat to come from the right that it's almost becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy because they're not trying to stop it in the meantime.
Well, if that's the argument, the fundamental premise is true, but it leads to their logic is off. The left are nihilists. There's no question about it, but that's what makes them the most dangerous. They're going to destroy. They will take over, and when they do, they will destroy. And we've seen it. We've seen it clearly in Seattle and Portland. In the riots of these leftist terrorist organizations like Antifa and Black Lives Matter. They want to riot, burn, loot, tear down statues, burn stuff, destroy stuff, kill people. That's who they are. The left is on its way to be in the Khmer Rouge. When they say the left are nihilists, that's absolutely true. Look at the Khmer Rouge, the Cambodian communists. Look what they did. And look what Mao did in China and turning loose the Red Guards, to beat up and kill professors and intellectuals and everything. They are nihilists. That's what makes them dangerous. They will destroy. They will absolutely take over, tear down, and destroy. That's what makes them the worst danger. By the way, Ayn Rand, of course, shows us that in every one of her novels. There's not a religious villain in any one of her 4 books. Everyone, in We the Living, it's the communists. In Anthem, it's some collectivist dictatorship of the future. In The Fountainhead, it's Ellsworth Toohey, a Marxist. In Atlas Shrugged, again, it's the leftists, it's the socialists. Every country in the world is a people state, and the United States is now on the cusp of becoming one. Ayn Rand showing us in her novels where the danger comes from, and the nihilistic nature of her Atlas Shrugged villains. Jim Taggart, brilliantly drawn nihilistic character, shows us the dangers. These guys want power not to glorify God, as the religionists will. They want power to destroy humans. That's what makes them dangerous. So if that's the premise of these supporters of liberty, they're right about the premise, but the logic leads to an entirely opposite conclusion. And I think you're right. I think Leonard Peikoff is recognizing that.
So Andy, I agree with you that the left is much worse than the right. In fact, I'll go further and agree with you that why bother with the left? Just forget about them. Let's concentrate on getting along with the right and helping them and teaching them what we can teach them. But let me play devil's advocate, because I think I might understand something about arguments against the right and coming from the dim perspective. And the argument is that it's a short-term versus long-term issue. So in the short term, it might be better to side with the right, but in the long term, the right is what's gonna last. It's gonna create a dictatorship that might last thousands of years, whereas the left can't form a dictatorship that lasts more than a few years and then it implodes in a world war or something like that.
Well, I understand that. It reminds me, I'm old enough to remember the 1980 presidential election when Ayn Rand came out vociferously against Reagan, not in support of Jimmy Carter, but she pleaded with her supporters not to vote for Reagan. And, and her reasoning, was impeccable. She said, whatever short-term benefits from a Reagan presidency will be drowned out in the long term, because what Reagan will accomplish, if accomplish is the right word, is in people's minds to associate capitalism with Christianity. Now, I understood what Ayn Rand was saying. I still voted for Reagan, and I'd vote for Reagan today.
He would have been 84, I believe.
He would have been what?
I think she would have voted for Reagan in 84 had she lived.
Possible. Obviously there's no way.
Yeah.
There's no way to know. But so I understand that religion is a long-term danger. I get it. But in the meantime, we have to have a country. And and by the way, somebody sent me a clip even before Leonard Peikoff came out publicly and stated he contributed modestly to the Trump campaign in 2020 and publicly stated that he voted for Trump, or he was going to vote for Trump. In 2016, somebody sent me a clip of Leonard speaking, endorsing, against Obama, and I don't even know if the Republicans had a candidate yet when Leonard made this tape. But he's pointing out that things are so bad in the short run. The left is so bad in the short run that we have to save the country, whatever the long-term dangers are. These are our only 2 alternatives. These are the only 2 who could possibly win national elections. And I certainly agreed with it. So even going back to 2016, Leonard Peikoff, even though you're right, he was claiming that religion is the longer-term threat. We still have to prevent the country from disintegrating or being destroyed by the leftists in the short run, and that's much worse now. The left is much worse today than they were 5 years ago. So I think the sense of urgency here of trying to convince the conservatives to embrace more objectivism and less religion, to stand up to the left. I think it's the only game in town if we want to save the country in the short run.
As much respect as I have for Peikoff, I have started to question the wisdom of just buying time, feeling that it's too defensive.
Well,
just saying we need to go on offense.
I don't think Peikoff said that, did he? That's
well, he said that his reason for, so I understand the buying time, but I think that it has become like a, justification for doing everything, and we have to be more about just buying time.
Yeah, but I'm worried about attributing that to Leonard Peikoff. Who makes that argument that we should vote for the left to buy time?
Vote for the conservatives, I think.
I think your own said
But I mean, I think you guys are right about going on offense, which is, well, here, let me make another point about the Republicans and the religious conservatives, and why I think they're a lot less bad than the leftists, and not just in the short run, maybe even in the long run. And that is, I already said I think Christianity, as bad as it is less bad than Marxism. But there's another. The Democrats are like pure Marxists now. They're pure German. They're not even Americans anymore. They're Germans. I mean, in terms of wherever they're born, wherever their citizenship is. Philosophically, the leftists and the Democrats are Germans. The Republicans and the religious conservatives, they still have an element of Americanism. They're not just religious. They still have some shred of respect for 18th century and the Enlightenment principles of individual rights. And once in a while, you'll hear prominent Republicans, Kristi Noem, for example, they're flawed, but once in a while, you'll hear them even use the term individual rights, which I couldn't tell you the last time I heard a Democrat use that term. They still have some respect, and they talk with respect of the founders. Trump, excuse me, were respectful of the founders. He established that 1776 commission to combat the horrendous evils of the 1619 Project and to tell the truth about America, the good and the bad. But the Republicans, they're still Americans in that regard. They still have some respect for the founders, for the principles of Jefferson and Madison, and who were slave owners. We always have to acknowledge and deplore that, but they were much more than just slave owners. They really took a gigantic, the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights. Jefferson and Madison and the other founders took a gigantic step forward in the support of human liberty. And the Republicans have some shred of respect for that the Democrats have just rejected. And so they're going on offense in part because we have to do more than politics. The real battle's in the field of education. Nevertheless, going on offense includes politics, and I think trying to fan the flames of the Americanism, the dying embers of that still alive to some degree in the Republican Party. If we can fan the flames of that would be a major step offensively. Going on offense in politics. We still have to win the battle in the education field, but that would still be a good step politically.
Sure.
I think that's the primary reason to engage with the right, is to try to develop this conversation over individual rights and the virtues of selfishness and egoism, and because that's what they need, right? And that's what we have to offer, is this perspective. And the other reason is because they already like Ayn Rand. A lot of conservatives have this history studying Ayn Rand.
Yeah,
and they
some
aren't.
Some do, yes.
Yeah, and they aren't negative towards her. They have a positive view. And whenever I talk to somebody from the left or the Democratic Party, it's a struggle to get them to even take her seriously.
Yeah, they are thoroughgoing Germans in their philosophy now. I don't mean to disparage Germany. Germany is at a great culture. In any field you want to name, the Germans have made intellectual advances. But German philosophy is a disaster. It led to National Socialism and Marxism. And yeah, the leftists, the Democrats, they're thoroughgoing collectivists. they do everything they can. They're on their road to 20 years from now, maybe less, they're going to be communists and do everything they can to expunge individuality. Whereas the Republicans not only have in their Christianity, not only have that, worship of the respect, at least for the personal soul, which is an individualistic element, but they also have that shred of Americanism, going back to the 18th century Enlightenment and the principle of what was known back then as the rights of man or individual rights. So that's the part, because personal soul is a faith-based belief, but the rights of man that the Enlightenment thinkers upheld, and that Ayn Rand explained why individual rights is necessary for human life and why human life is the standard of value, they still have some respect for that. We could again explain it better, fan the flames of it that still exist in the Republican Party politically in the short run and maybe in the long run. That's our only hope to save the country.
If somebody likes Ayn Rand and they happen to be Christian, I'm going to support them in liking Ayn Rand, not to say don't like Ayn Rand unless you're ready to give up your Christianity.
Right. It's not an accident that there's this whole movement of people that call themselves Christian objectivists. I've yet to find anybody who called himself a Marxist objectivist, because there aren't any. Now
libertarian socialist.
Yeah, right, yeah. But a lot of objectivists understandably cringe at the phrase Christian objectivism because it's a contradiction. I get that, but first of all, I think most people who consider themselves that were Christians to start with, and then later on read Ayn Rand, and so you have rational philosophy making inroads on faith-based philosophy, which is good, but at this, despite it being mixed up with faith-based beliefs, there is a large element of of respect for reason and individual rights and liberty amongst Christian objectivists. So I'm certainly going to support them. Certainly politically in today's culture, against the leftists, there's a lot of good there. Whereas the leftists are either nihilists or they're on their way. So Ayn Rand explained them. Jim Taggart. I would tell all people, read Atlas Shrugged, pay special attention to the character of Jim Taggart, who wants to destroy, because that's who the American left is increasingly becoming.
And he did have power.
Yeah.
One of the obstacles I think we should appreciate is the difference between the mythologies of the right and the left. On the right, you have Christian mythology and other religious mythologies, and they are very old. They're very weak. They've been attacked for centuries, and they're ready to basically crumble. And if you talk to a lot of Christians, they don't believe in a lot of the old nonsense that's in the Old Testament, or even some of the nonsense that's in the New Testament. They just reject it as like an allegory or something like that. But if you talk to the left, they're inventing new mythology today.
That's right.
And we have not had centuries to attack it yet. And it's fresh for them. It's real for them. They're living in this fictional world. And it's hard to break through that sort of psychology.
Yeah, that's a good point, William. The major, while you were speaking, the one example there's several, but one that's been around for maybe 30 years now, is pernicious man-made warming, which is mythology. Carbon dioxide plays little role in warming, and a number of climate scientists point out the overwhelming preponderance of carbon dioxide spewed into the atmosphere every year comes from natural sources, not human sources anyhow. So you're right. That's part of their strength. It's a double-edged sword for them because it's also part of their weakness. But it's part of their strength in that, they control the media, they broadcast this stuff, and there hasn't been a lot of time to counterattack it. And even when there is, when people do counterattack it, the media doesn't give any airtime to leading climate scientists.
Right.
Greta Thunberg, who knows that poor kid knows basically nothing. She becomes a saint of the media. I've seen this meme on Facebook, and it's true. Whereas Dr. Judith Curry, a leading climate scientist who's very skeptical about the hypothesis. She's almost never on CNN or CBS News or covered by the New York Times and so on. But so yeah, the newness of it protects them, like you said, in contrast to religion. But it's also a weakness for them because it's completely at odds with reality. And with for people who do some research and actually see the truth, we can reason not with the leftists; they're basically beyond reason, but maybe with rank and file Democrat voters and just with every man and every woman who's who are more open to reason than hardcore leftists are. We have the evidence, so it's part of their weakness. It's mythical. It's mythical. You're right. It's part of their weakness.
It's sort of like a relationships. A guy, he'll date a woman, he'll fall in love, he'll propose, he'll get married, he'll have a kid with her, and they have a whole life together over many years. And then some hot woman at a bar teases him or something, and then he jumps on that, not realizing he's destroying everything he had with his wife. And now he's just attracted by the shiny new thing at the bar. That's kind of what leftists are. They're just attracted to the shiny new mythologies.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I remember. No, I get your point. But remember, the universities have been and the humanities divisions of our universities, the public school system, many of the private schools have been dominated by leftist philosophy for 100 years, going back to John Dewey and William Hurt Kilpatrick and others at Columbia University Teachers College 100 years ago. The leftists controlled the educational system. They have for 100 years. And so as a general rule, with some notable exceptions, the more people go to college, the more who get brainwashed into this philosophy. And so, when they hold this basically German philosophy, what Ayn Rand called the social primacy of consciousness, that truth is socially constructed, or reality is socially constructed, moral principles are socially constructed. They're holding this. It's irrational. It's subjective. It's delusional. It makes them very susceptible to these shiny new mythologies that you're referring to.
Altruism is easier to explain to children.
Yes, for sure. But you have gazillions of. If you look at, again, one of my favorite issues is the global warming or the climate change issue. Because if you look at most of the college-educated people, I'll bet most of them believe the mythology. Whereas if you look at Americans who are not college educated, I'll bet most of them reject it. And it's like being indoctrinated with this delusional philosophy makes you more and more susceptible to the shiny new mythologies, as you put it very nicely. Whereas going to work and then dealing every day with reality, and this common sense dealing with the real world makes you less susceptible to these kinds of mythologies, even when they're shiny. And so I think the colleges have become, and the educational system more broadly has become a cesspool of irrational, anti-American, anti-capitalist ideas. And I think the real battle is in the field of education, which is why I'm writing a book on education right now, the current book I'm working on.
I remember before the pandemic, you were doing the education guy. I mean, you are out there. I think you were wearing like a GoPro camera, walking through halls of the school or something.
Yeah, it's on my phone. It was just on my iPhone.
Okay.
Yeah, I was in because that was right before the schools were shut down, like February 2020. I was just walking through the halls or in the classroom with my phone, talking about what went on in class, not mentioning names. I didn't even mention the name of the school. Never mind the names of the kids. But I remember one day having a rant, it was in the classroom, after all the kids had left, on my iPhone. Education guy was talking about 20 students in that class, 20 students in American kids all in a college class, and 10 of them, 50%, had never heard of James Madison, never heard of him. And the other 10 at least had heard of him and knew he was president of the United States. But nobody not 1 in 20 knew that he was the lead author of the U.S. Constitution.
I thought you were going to say
Virtually
the other 10 thought he was a bigot.
Yeah, well, yeah. And didn't know that he was virtually the sole author of the Bill of Rights. And I was apoplectic. I mean, they don't teach history. They don't even call it history. They call it social studies, whatever the hell that is. They deliberately dumbed down the educational system so the kids can't think. And that makes them more susceptible to the leftist propaganda that you just mentioned. You know, the world according to Howard Zinn, that all that the founders were slave owners. That's all they were. You know, which we acknowledge and deplore. But that's all they were. They were nothing but slave owners. And America is a racist nation. You know, going all the way back to its founding, and that's the bottom line truth and the essentials about the United States. The kids are much more susceptible to that mythology because they don't know anything. And not only they don't know anything, they haven't been trained to think at all. I mean, the educators have very often given up on phonics, and so they, you know, for various versions of the whole word method, and they, you know, they don't know. They struggle with the mechanics of reading. Consequently, reading comprehension is very difficult for them, and they don't have basic thinking skills like reading, and so they can't critique the leftist mythology that they're bombarded with every day. It's heartbreaking as well as terrifying for the future of the country.
Absolutely.
Do you have any ideas on the link between pragmatism and the current sort of popular philosophy where people just cycle through new trends and ideas and don't really have a fixed belief or standards?
It's interesting. Pragmatism, of course, that's an American philosophy. William James, the great psychologist, who I wrote my doctoral dissertation on, by the way, you know, was one of the founders of pragmatism. Sure. and John Dewey, of course. And the essence of pragmatism is that truth changes from time period to time period, from maybe even from day to day, and
from identity group.
yeah, but right. And truth changes. It's in a flux, and what was true 1,000 years ago, or maybe even 10 years ago, is not necessarily true any longer. So it's a disdain for theoretical principles, and it's a as Ayn Rand would put it, range of the moment, a matter of expediency today was what's gonna satisfy us today, and it's very subjective in the sense that we start with the subject. The subject has you, Scott, me, Scott, William, anybody. We have certain desires, we have certain hopes, certain aspirations. And so what's going to enable us to satisfy them? And whatever enables us to satisfy those aspirations or hopes or wishes is the truth. And so objective reality is just pushed off the scene altogether. I think it's not an accident, I don't think, that Dewey, one of the leading pragmatist philosophers, and also the major influence on the American school system for 100 years now, and they don't teach the kids how to think at all, and so the kids can't possibly come out of the schools holding any principles. They don't, and so I think there's a major connection between pragmatism and the results of the American schools, the anti-intellectual results of the American school system. I see it with my college kids. I won't mention any names, because a lot of them are great kids. They're Americans, but they, real American kids. I mean, they want to have a successful career. They know that, and they want to have a happy, fulfilling romantic relationship. They want to be happy.
Some of the woke nuts are trying to be good.
Yeah, they're good kids. I would adopt some of them if it came to that. But they don't know how to think. They don't even have reading skills in many cases, and the math professors tell me the same thing. They don't have any basic math skills, and consequently, they have no knowledge. And so, I think pragmatism has had a major influence in destroying the intellectual abilities or undermining the intellectual abilities abilities of the American people via Dewey's influence on the school system, I think, is the conduit between pragmatist philosophy and the state we see today, where you got so many people who don't know anything and struggle just to read.
There seems to be a psychological method of thinking that pragmatism teaches, where you kind of ignore the past or don't focus on the past. Because if you focus on the past, I guess you would naturally start to develop standards, because you would see connections in the evidence, and you would then use that as the basis for forming your standards of how to act. But pragmatism seems to focus on, the now and the future. And that, I think that's a formula for disaster. I don't think it teaches you, it inculcates an erroneous psychological method.
Yeah, you reminded me of that famous line from George Santayana, who was a philosophy professor at Harvard in early 20th century, a colleague of William James there. His famous, I don't remember the exact wording, but his famous line that, those who are ignorant of history are doomed to repeat it. Yeah, that's certainly true. Because if we knew, and I think that's part of the reason why the leftist educators, in quote, because they're the anti-educators, part of the reason why they don't want to teach history, and they certainly don't want to teach American history. And if they do any, they're reading, Howard Zinn and the Marxist interpretation
right.
of American history. But yeah, I mean, if we actually did study history, and we saw the principles the United States was founded on, the freedom and the prosperity, the immigrants wanting to come here, still wanting to come here, the late 19th century America, which is historians call the Gilded Age, as a quote of Mark Twain, was I renamed it in the Capitalist Manifesto, the inventive period. You see this just outpouring of inventions and new technologies and new theories and everything. You see America just becoming this enormously prosperous nation based on its freedom, and becoming a beacon to immigrants from all over the world. If the kids know real American history, including all the warts, that slavery was baked into it, at the start, but you have to know the full truth. Slavery contradicts the basic founding principles of the country and led directly to the Civil War and the 13th Amendment ending slavery. Whereas societies around the world that don't have the principle of individual rights, as their basic principle, there's still slavery. Every communist country is slave. Sudan has thousands and thousands of black slaves. They need the principle of individual rights to abolish slavery. So they need the full truth about history. And since the leftists don't want to teach it, that tells us something about them.
Yeah, and I think I talked about momentum a couple of shows and what direction you're moving, and I think that it's just always the nature that it's going to be imperfect people making those first stabs at advancements. Even the Magna Carta wasn't about rights for everyone; it was just rights for the barons, basically.
Right.
And and that's how it starts. And yes, so it was slaveholders that set the basis for there not being slaves. It's how things get better. There's going to be people suggesting things now that'll help, and we can't just wait for John Galt to come along and just say, oh, I don't like the way he tweets, or whatever it is your issue is with him.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Baby steps. Mankind moves forward in baby steps, and the founding of the United States was much more than a baby step. It was a huge step. And first of all, we need the full truth. All of the Northern founders were abolitionists. I mean, Benjamin Franklin had owned slaves earlier in his life, but he freed them, at least in part because he recognized that the burgeoning principle of individual rights that he endorsed was incompatible with slavery. And Alexander Hamilton and John Adams and Thomas Paine, they were all abolitionists. We need to remember that too. And and the Virginians were slave owners. Yes, that's true, and that's horrible. They were also abolitionists in theory. But anyhow, the key point, of course, is what's necessary. Remember, Ayn Rand taught us integrate, see the big picture. you know, a truth has to be first tied to reality and then integrated into, you know, a wider context. Slavery has existed forever. It still exists. Like, you know, every communist country uses slave labor. As we speak, North Korea, as little kids, and in China, and the gulags, they, you know, all kinds of innocent people at slave labor. Sudan, you know, there's thousands and thousands of non-Islamic blacks enslaved in Sudan, and so on and so forth. They need the principle of individual rights to have a 13th, something that's equivalent to a 13th Amendment in their own society. They need individual rights. There's no abolition movement without it. It's not an accident that the abolitionist movement is born. Where and when? In Britain and during the 18th century. You know, in the country where the principle of individual rights, the Lockean principle of individual rights, is starting to gain cultural currency. That's not a historic accident. So, you know, you see why the leftists fear history. There are lessons here that they don't want kids to learn.
Right. If it's not that caricature of, you know, dead white men are evil.
Right. Yeah, that's why we're going to eliminate Shakespeare from the literature, you know, curriculum, because it's one of the dreaded dwems. Because a dead white European male, all that matters is race, gender, you know, and time period. Literary quality means nothing. So yeah, it's so, you know, it's this is why I'm writing the book on education, and it's directed to the parents. They need to know. A lot of parents have this idea, you know, they're innocent. We'll drop the kids off at school on the way to work, and the schools will educate them. And oh, that is not true, and it's never been true. But it's less true today than it was, you know, 50 years ago, or certainly less true than it was 100 years ago, before Dewey's influence became prevalent in the American schools.
I don't want to get too overconfident about baby steps, but recently it has been heartening to see some parents stand up at these school board meetings against CRT.
Yeah, and black parents too.
Right.
Yeah, that's excellent. That is good news. That a lot of American parents of school kids of all races are recognizing the horrors of, you know, of this completely racist interpretation of American history, denunciation of white people as inherently racist and evil. It's heartening to see American parents stand up, and also a baby step. You know, I admire people like Candace Owens, who is fearless, you know, against the left, and you know, and starting to generate more of a conservative movement amongst Black Americans. And I think Trump gets some credit for that. I think Trump had a hand in that. And it's good to see. You know, we've had brilliant Black scholars like the immortal Thomas Sowell and the late great Walter Williams, and you know, people, you know, strong freedom fighters like Larry Elder, and you know, and now Candace Owens. It's good to see the Black conservative movement growing, and there's real courage there, because you and I, yeah, as white guys, you know, if we stand up against the left, we're just going to be, you know, labeled racist. Big deal. I hear that from the left every day. But Black conservatives, the verbal abuse that's heaped upon them, I won't even repeat this stuff on the air, because they're apostates. The left expects Black Americans to be leftists, and you know, and they're apostates.
Uncle Tom.
Like, I wouldn't even use some of the term race traitor, you know, and stuff. But it's unconscionable the way Black conservatives are demonized by the left. And by the way, I'd recommend Larry Elder's film Uncle Tom that came out last year about the history of the Black conservative movement. It's very good. And it's
I'll have to check that out. You know, even beyond politics, I saw this summer where these rioters were basically going up to these Black police officers or other, you know, minority police officers, and just trying to browbeat them and say, you shouldn't even be out here. And, you know, I mean,
yeah, right.
Appealing to some tribal instinct to try to convert them from the rule of law. Yeah,
like the police are the police are the enemy of the Black Americans. The police are, America is oppressive of black citizens, which it was in the past. Not so much anymore. And the police are oppressors, the police are the danger to black lives, ignoring, of course, the inconvenient truth that something like 5,000 to 7,000 black Americans are murdered every year, 90% of them by black thugs, very few by the cops, relatively very few. And that the black on white rate of violent crime is 10 times the white on black rate of violent crime. The left doesn't want evidence. They don't want facts. This is why they don't read Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell is an evidence machine. He really is. If you're going to read two people, I would tell people, if you're going to read two people, you really want to understand what's going on in the world, one, read Ayn Rand, and two, read Thomas Sowell. Ayn Rand will give you the philosophic principles, and Thomas Sowell will give you the facts. And you can integrate that into a big picture that just smashes the leftist delusions. So yeah, the left doesn't want you reading those two. One's a woman and one's a black man. They're both supposed to be leftists.
They're great. They're an oppressed tribes.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So they're apostates. They've left the one true faith for something that's for something that's false. And under Sharia law in Islam, they'll kill apostates. Well, if the left had the power to do it, they would do that too. And within 10 or 20 years, I'm afraid they will have that kind of power. That's why I'm so active and standing up against them.
Yeah, and just in the wake of your piece, you called it the left is vastly more evil than religious conservatives, and my favorite word in the title is vastly, which is it makes it devoid of moral ambiguity. And I'm curious if you received pushback from the objectivists or others in the liberty movement for your view. I know you did an interview that was pretty respectful with Harry Biswinger right after.
Yeah, well, Harry and I discussed it, debated it, and it was very, I have a lot of respect for Dr. Biswinger. I think he has the same for me, and was very respectful. We disagreed. It was very respectful. I got pushback. I won't mention names from prominent objectivists. It was up on my buddy Mark DeCuna at capitalismmagazine.com, who published the essay, posted it on HBL and sent me the responses. And some of them were disrespectful. Some were respectful. Some agreed. Some respectfully disagreed. But there was a great deal of rationalism in the disagreement. So for instance, one of the main point I made as white Christianity is much less bad than the left is historically. The Christians burned a lot of people at the stake, and they murdered a lot of infidels. Don't get me wrong; I'm not going to defend Christianity here, but relatively, the numbers are vastly diminished. And it's a lot of objectivists have said to me, "Well, it's because of technology. If the Christians back 1,000 years ago had gas chambers and stuff, they would have murdered tens of millions of people too." And that's a mistake. It's not the case. And counterexamples, state-of-the-art research in history says Genghis Khan, 13th century Mongol conqueror, was responsible for 40 million murders, 40 million, using swords and spears and fire. But the real reason that technology is not the answer goes to the communist favorite method of mass murder, starvation, to deliberately starve your victims. Stalin, just seized all the food from Ukraine in 1932, and murdered 5 to 7 million Ukrainians in the Holodomor, the Ukrainian terror famine. Now, It's true Stalin had trains and trucks and stuff to cart that stuff away. But if you were to do it with dog carts and ponies and stuff, it could be done also just more inconveniently. And furthermore, the real method would be to burn it. All you need is rub two sticks together to start a fire, to burn the crops and starve people by the millions. So technology is not the reason that the Christians murdered vastly fewer. The reason is they had respect for free will. They would offer you, overwhelmingly would offer you the alternative, convert or die. Now, that's a brutal choice, but it is a choice. Right. And the Christians had some respect for free will, and a lot of people converted and saved their lives. Whereas the leftists, the socialists, Stalin didn't offer the Ukrainians the alternative, convert to communism, or die. He just killed them. And Hitler never offered any alternative to the Jews or to Slavic peoples he considered inferior. He didn't offer the alternative, convert to National Socialism. Or no, he just killed them. The Christians, because of their respect for the personal soul, have some last element of belief in free will that the modernists, the collectivists, are determinists. You're born into a certain race, and that makes you evil for the Nazis. And for the communists, you're raised in the owning class, and by the time you're an adult, you're an oppressor and you're evil, and there's no way to change it. So we just kill you. There's no respect for the soul or individuality or free will. So that's the reason that the Christians are vastly less bad. Now, you asked about the pushback. Well, a few people said, well, I went to Catholic school or whatever, and the Christians have a real problem with free will, because God knows what's coming, and if God knows what's coming, that to him we're just, like atoms, being pushed around by physical law. There's no free will. It's really a determinist worldview. I said, well, yeah, that's true theoretically, but let's get away from the abstractions for just a second. Look at the real world, in real time, in real life, in the real world. The Christians overwhelmingly offered, infidels or whatever, convert or die. Their hope was to convert the non-believers, whereas the Nazis and communists, their attempt is to murder, their enemies, not convert them. So
Yeah.
In real time, free will is real for the Christians, however much theoretical difficulty they have with it.
Such a deeper determinism from these postmodernists. First, just the way Marx sold inevitability, that their way is just where things are going. And I mean, that is, just like the future belongs to insert oppressed identity group here, it is the same kind of determinism. It's in some ways worse, because they're doing it to demoralize us in the present, to say, give up.
Yeah, and their determinist philosophy. I mean, my critics of that essay are right, and I acknowledge that they were right. But the Christians contradict themselves, and their very contradictory nature is a defense of man. They contradicted their philosophy in action because they wanted conversion. Whereas with the leftists, with the full socialists, there's no last element of respect for the individual, the personal soul, or free will, as we discussed at the top of the show. There's nothing mitigating their determinism. For the Nazis, you're hardwired evil if you're born into a certain race. If you're a Jew, if you're Slavic, you're hardwired as inferior, and you're the only good that you're good for is either be enslaved or be annihilated. And the communists, they're determinists by nature. The communists by nurture. You're raised in the owning class, you're educated by the owning class, and by the time you're an adult, you're steeped in its worldview. It's the way you see the world. You can't see it any differently. You're an oppressor, and there's no way to convert you. And so we just annihilate you. We just inveterate, class, unremitting class warfare. We just wipe out the owning class. I had this quote from one of Lenin's secret police officers from the Black Book of Communism. He's exhorting his troops. He's telling them, we're not quote, I don't remember the exact wording, but quote, we don't make war on any people in particular. Rather, we're exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class, unquote. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, that's much better. We're not racists. We don't kill people because of their race. No, we're class warriors. We kill them because of their economic class. But yeah, it's hardwired into you.
Yeah, and then it's the arbitrary nature of just saying, you're bourgeois if they don't like you. I mean, there were people even in the Soviet Union accused of being fascists.
Yeah, members of the party.
Right.
Stalin purged the party. I don't know how many communists he had murdered. Yeah, and people who, by our objectivist standards, were evil, but people who, by his communist standards, should have been heroes. He should have been considered heroes. They were hardcore communists. They weren't traitors to communism. He had them murdered. You could accuse them of being imperialists or capitalist spies or or secretly bourgeois or whatever. All you had to do was impute that to them, and any hint of being a class enemy, that's it. To a gulag thou goes, where you're probably going to be dead in a matter of months.
Absolutely.
Andy, in your debate with Dr. Binswanger, one of the points he made was that religion doesn't have a common conceptual common denominator with collectivism or the left. And so there was this mixture of levels in your argument. Can you respond to that? And maybe since you've had more time to think about it, tell us, if you think he had a point or what was wrong with it.
No, that's a trenchant point, that the kind of point you come to expect from Dr. Binswanger. It's very philosophical and very insightful. But I disagree, because I was talking about the history of Christianity includes many horrors, but talking about Christianity at the height of its powers, and contrast it with collectivism at the height of its powers. So in the Dark Ages, the Christians killed gazillions of innocent victims, although not nearly as many as the collectivists. And we already explained why. The allegiance to free will on the part of the Christians and its rejection on the part of the collectivists. But there's another point here, and that is the medieval Renaissance that very few people even remember anymore. When I talk about the medieval Renaissance, I think a lot of people could think I'm talking about the Italian Renaissance. And no, the medieval Renaissance is, we're talking about Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas. And this is in the 12th century and the 13th century. When Aristotle's works were rediscovered largely from the Islamic world, and Catholic scholars like Albert the Great and St. Thomas and others risked their lives to study Aristotle, and they won. They won against the church, against the Christianity at the height of its powers. This is the 1100s and the 1200s. The church couldn't stop these scholars. They tried. They burned people at the stake, but they're evil. But they couldn't stop these scholars from studying Aristotle and then spreading this rational, this worldly philosophy that by the 14th century results in the Italian Renaissance. Now, there's no equivalent of that under collectivism. Now, you might argue it hasn't been around long enough, but collectivism at the height of its powers, the way the church was at the height of its powers during the medieval Renaissance, killed you, all of you, round you up, take you to a gulag or to Auschwitz, and they'll gas you, they'll starve you, they'll enslave you, they'll kill you, and they'll burn the school to the ground. There's no possibility of an equivalent Renaissance under collectivism at the height of its powers. Islam at the height of its powers in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries AD was a golden age, a legitimate golden age of great advances in mathematics and astronomy and medicine and great literature written before it was crushed by Islam. But it existed. It doesn't exist under the collectivists. That's the answer.
As much as I agree with that, I just think that you're almost conceding too much to have to compare Christians of old versus these collectivists of the present, because we're not fighting the medieval Christians.
Yeah, but I think Harry's point was Christianity today has been, it's not Christianity anymore. It's been, certainly in America, it's been so mixed with
That's another reason to hook up with them.
Yeah, oh no, exactly. But I was saying, even at the height of its powers, when it was undiluted Christianity, even undiluted Islam during its golden age, is not as evil as undiluted National Socialism or communism. Now, granted, that's damning the religionists with faint praise. Oh, you're not as bad as Hitler, but still, it's true, and it's important. And your point is a good one. The Christians have become, many of them, integrated with the Enlightenment philosophy and the rights of man. Christians over and over and over again respect the American founding. They respect the founders. they'll acknowledge slavery and as an evil and everything, but they recognize more the full truth, and they acknowledge the founders in a way that the leftists don't. And you're right. That's important. That's an important point. All the more reason to support them against the left politically, when one or the other is going to win national elections. It has to be one or the other.
So one of Dr. Binswanger's points was that religion offers a whole philosophy, like a metaphysical view, an epistemological view, and all that, going all the way up to like maybe a theocracy even. Whereas collectivism, he said, is basically just a moral, political ideology, and it leaves open, the foundations of that in metaphysics, and you can kind of come up with all kinds of different metaphysical views and epistemological views. But this leads me to the phenomenon of wokeism now being considered a religion. And it's like, okay, so now we have a leftist religion. Does that make it now do we have a conceptual common denominator between the religious conservatives and religious collectivists on the left?
There's a lot of interesting points there. First of all, I don't think wokeism is, or anything from the left is a religion. I think it's analogous. Religion, if we're going to be literal, means, I think anyway, my view is faith-based belief in a supernatural realm. I think now the leftists are secular, and wokeism is wokeism has more in common with National Socialism than with Christianity, because it's a racist worldview rather than another worldly, supernatural worldview. It's earthly. It's about racism.
But it is supernatural when they start saying that, you can have many genders, or there are different realities for different identity groups.
But it's not specifically supernatural in that we're referencing a higher world. It's delusional. It's psychotic the way religion is. That's why I think it's analogous.
I just put it as
a secular delusion.
I see religion as just a mystical philosophy. So once to the degree they're adding mystical elements, it's a religion.
Well, we still have to distinguish the otherworldly, supernatural, faith-based delusions from this worldly,
the Judeo-Christian religion versus the woke religion. All right, if you want to put it that way, we just have to realize that wokeism is not so much Christian or Judaic as it is Nazi and Marxist. You have it's class war, race war, poisonous mixture, and it is as delusional as religion, even though it's secular. But
let's say it's not supernatural, but it does have a metaphysical view now. It's like this, your subjective realm is the truth, and so you have this plural verse, and then you have this whole philosophical framework building up around wokeism. And so then there's the conceptual common denominator in that they're both just ideologies. They're full philosophies now.
No, I can see the connection here. The religion in its methodology is very similar to the left, because Ayn Rand points out in that lead essay in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, that since the religionists project this higher world, but and they get the truth from God. But in reality, there is no higher world. So where are they getting this from? Well, it's subjective. It's as subjective as the woke mentality. In method, in content, they're different. In method, they're the same. They're subjectivist. They're just going with their own feelings, their own desires, their own hopes, wishes, and wants. So I can see the connection there. But I did want to get back to what you said before about Dr. Binswanger's point about collectivism being mostly a political ideology. As much as I respect Dr. Binswanger, I disagree, and I disagreed with that's the main reason I disagreed with the dim hypothesis of Dr. Peikoff, in that the leftist politics is even more philosophical, I would argue, than religion, because it has all of German philosophy supporting it. It has Kant, Hegel, and Marx supporting it. There's a whole philosophical system that's much more sophisticated than the crude faith-based philosophy of religion. Now, Kant and Hegel are very, very difficult to read, but there's, it's a whole philosophic system there in metaphysics and epistemology that's vastly more sophisticated than religion. And that's why I think it's vastly more dangerous. You have the all of modernist philosophy, which today includes postmodernism and critical race theory. There's a whole philosophy here, German philosophy, and so I disagree. I disagree with that point.
I look at it like what's it take to fool people? So like in thousands of years ago, people were willing to believe in many gods. After a while, that stopped working. So then it was one God, and then even that stopped working. And that's when, even as people were becoming less religious, Marx was putting together kind of something for atheists that still wanted to have a mystical worldview.
Yeah, that's a good point, I think, because we've gone through in the West as the slow climb out of the Dark Ages, the medieval Renaissance into the Italian Renaissance, the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment, and Western culture became more rational, less faith-based, tortuously, but slowly. It did. Less supernatural and more secular and natural. And so that old time religion didn't work nearly as well in an era where science has made such advances, explained so much, and benefited human life so dramatically. So that if you're gonna fool people today on a massive scale, you need a more secular philosophy. And
in fact, Marx, to contrast utopian socialism, which had failed several times, he's the one that actually called his scientific socialism.
Yes, he did. That's exactly right.
Which was and Rand talked about that they're using the guise of science to promote their mystical beliefs about cosmic consciousness or whatever it is at the time.
Yeah, yes, that's true. And if you don't mind, I want to go back to that discussion with Harry Binswanger.
Yeah.
Because I just at the very end I didn't have time to explain what I was saying. But what I'm going to edit the essay, and I'm going to include this point, and that is the Christians inherited a world that an ancient world that was advanced in the humanities, Greek philosophy, as one example. But technologically and in terms of technology, industry, and living standards was primitive by the standards of our day. Whereas the collectivists, they inherited, the modern industrial revolution, certainly in Germany, the Nazis did, and the communists, to some extent in Russia. They inherited a world, let's put it this way, the Christians caused a dark age from a fall from a relatively low bar, but the collectivists caused what I call a red age, because not just because the communists wore red shirts, but red for human blood. The 120 million, as a conservative estimate, murdered by the Nazis and National Socialists and Communists. They brought civilization down from a much higher bar. They inherited a much higher bar and brought it down to, look at Germany at the end of World War II. I mean, look at any of these communist regimes. They collapsed. They brought it down from a vastly higher bar than the Christians inherited. And Ayn Rand shows this brilliantly in Anthem. If you're an entirely collectivist world and there's no country of individual rights or capitalism anywhere that the collectivists can steal from, then you're going to fall to a dark age, at least as dark as the original dark age, and from a much higher level. The precipitous drop is much higher, which really, from a much higher level, it's much sharper. It really speaks to the evil of collectivism.
This goes to something that comes up is that some people believe that there couldn't be a new dark ages, that we're so technologically advanced that it would be impossible.
Well, yeah, I hope so. Let's see. I don't want to project.
I'm less certain about that. I think some of what there's been a school of thought that says, well, the dark ages weren't actually that dark. And that's sort of by people that I think wouldn't mind if there was a new one as much. But in addition to that, just in saying that there's, that we can't have a dark ages, it basically supports the anything goes attitude. There's no consequences. I mean, I see a future where, they could end up, just like outlawing certain technologies if it was created by an oppressor or something. It has to be reinvented.
Look, environmentalism is a development of the left, and they are heavily anti-technology and anti-industrial revolution. So if we get that version of a leftist dictatorship, and it is possible, then yeah, I could see, all kinds of the initiation of force against many different kinds of many different industries and technologies, and I could see a regression. Not to mention the fact that if anybody speaks out against it, in the dictatorship, as Ayn Rand points out, they're going to be killed. And if they speak out against environmentalism, they're going to be killed, and the leftists will completely control the school system and impose even worse thought control than we have today. And people will come to believe that technology is evil. I don't think technological advance saves us from regression in that way. Philosophy. This is. Let's not mix technology with philosophy. This is the impact philosophy has on the world. Certainly, if the jihadists win, they don't have any regard for science or technology. They may smash it all. So philosophy is what it controls. Is the philosophy of a culture is what determines the direction it goes in, not the technology.
I agree. I think that technology is often a lagging indicator. It's a manifestation of making good decisions.
Yeah, well, and having freedom. That Steve Jobs and Stephen Wozniak could sit out in his mother's garage. They don't have to get permission from the secular or the religious authority to be hobbyists and work on building new computers and stuff, and then attract investment. They're free to attract investment. They're free to found Apple. They're free to fire Steve Jobs. They're free to bring him back. They're free to create the Mac and then the iMac products. The principle of individual right. So they're free to go into competition against IBM. And that's necessary for these kinds of advances. Once the leftists gain control, especially with an environmentalist version, they're going to impose thought control and bring an anti-technology, anti-industrial mentality along with it. It is a recipe for regression. I think Ayn Rand is right. If we had a collective, Ayn Rand was writing Anthem in the 1930s. Now, granted, it's a fantasy. She's not saying that this is not a real life story like the Fountainhead set in America in the 1930s, and We the Living set in Soviet Union 1920s. It's a romantic fantasy. Nevertheless, I think Ayn Rand does believe that a collectivist world. I think what she's shown us is that this is what a collectivist world would look like when there's no capitalist world to steal from. And and she's writing in the 1930s in America. With a world of telephones, no televisions yet, but telephones, radios, electricity, electric light, automobiles, airplanes. She's writing from a technologically advanced standpoint about this complete collapse into a dark age. I think she's saying that even though this is a romantic fantasy, I think she's saying that this is a logical outgrowth of what a collectivist world would look like, and I think she's right.
Sure. Absolutely.
I think we are starting from a high bar of civilization, and if the left gets their grips on it, it's going to take a while to collapse it because we have so much technology and so much science. But I think we're already starting to see signs of problems. You have that freeze in Texas where they lost power and people died during the freeze. We get blackouts now in California because we don't have enough power. There are signs that, for decades, reason and Enlightenment teaching has been lacking in the colleges and universities, and we're seeing the impact of that throughout
Right.
the economy in certain places.
Yes, and it's really terrifying that leftist environmentalist philosophy is co-opting science, and the IPCC and the anthropogenic global warming or man-made global warming hypothesis is terrifying in that regard. You have scientists who are pushing this utterly false mythology, and other scientists who are intimidated into silence because they won't get any funding, if they speak the truth on this issue. And so they're pushing. What's their solution? They want to eliminate the use of fossil fuels and replace it with windmills, and solar and stuff, which simply doesn't have the capacity to fire the electric grid. It doesn't have that. They're going to bring us down, to a very, very low standard of living if they have their way. And it's based on mythology. I mean, the truth about climate change is it's overwhelmingly natural, only trivially man-made, and warming is good for life on Earth in contrast to the colder periods. Based on utter mythology, they're going to, severely diminish living standards in the Western world. And what's really terrifying is how much science has been co-opted by this corrupt philosophy. And too many scientists, we were talking at the outset, people who are afraid to stand up and speak out, they don't have the moral courage because in this case, their careers and their funding's on the line. We're starting to see some who will. Judith Curry, who resigned from Georgia Tech over this, is one example, but not enough. Not enough. If science is taken over by the environmentalist left, then yeah, that's a big step downward, in the way that we're discussing.
It also affects women's sports, like you were talking about, people, letting men compete in women's sports. So the logical outcome of that is to just have irrationality reign in the sports world, and then we're going to have men who are the victors in women's sports. So it's going to be,
which we already have, and
it'll just become a ridiculous sort of thing, and that's just one area of the society.
Yeah,
it's gonna reach out its tentacles into all areas of society eventually,
and already does. I mean, you're right. I could be any gender I want to be, and a biological male, if he identifies as female, and could then participate or compete in women's sports. This is insanity. It's It's philosophic. It's an institutionalized insanity. And I saw a column from Victor Davis Hanson yesterday. I put it up on my Facebook page. He's one of the, I think, very insightful conservative commentators. Sure. He pointed out that there's this woke mentality. They control the humanities divisions in our universities. They control the teachers' colleges and the public schools. They control many of the private schools. They control a lot of wealthy, powerful corporations, control Hollywood. They control most of the media. They control most of social media, control the Democratic Party. They have enormous power, and they are delusional. They're sick, crazy people, and pathologically vicious. They want to destroy America. They're nihilists. And they have a lot of power. We live in a scary time. And that's why, wouldn't Ayn Rand once say that she wasn't brave enough to remain silent or something?
To be a coward. Yeah, she saw too clearly.
Yeah, wasn't brave enough to be a coward. Right, nicely put. Yeah, I'm not brave enough to just keep my mouth shut and just let the left control the country, with the re-education camps and euphemism for gulags that will then follow.
You were bringing up people that were pressured on global warming. I mean, I think, and I should say, you may be the #1 expert in the world when it comes to Ayn Rand's characters. You basically wrote the Cliff's Notes for Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, and I mean, to do that, it says something about how much you're trusted. I mean, just to cut anything from Ayn Rand is like, no one wants to do it. But I'm curious just about, because that happens in the book where they kind of bring Dagny in and they're all kind of just pressuring her at the last minute to say she's going along with whatever latest scheme they've cooked up?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Was there a question?
No, I'm just, that reminded me of that because that I also, there are a couple of things. I also think blackmail is a recurring theme in Atlas Shrugged. I mean, I think, would you agree we're naive to think that's not happening today in the political world?
Oh yeah, yeah. I think it happens all the time. This is what interesting phenomena with Joe Manchin. You know, he's like the lone Democrat, or at least prominent Democrat, who's remotely sane, and he won't knuckle under. God only knows what kind of pressure he's under to go along with with the leftist agenda.
Biden gave his wife a job.
What does his wife do? I'm not sure.
It's some, basically some commission on getting money to elites or something.
So is that okay?
I'm paraphrasing.
Oh, okay. I can't imagine what kind of pressure he's under from the Democratic Party leadership and the leftist ideologues, and are they trying to blackmail him? I wouldn't be surprised if they if they do. So it's always been around in politics. I think it's the left is really playing hardball these days. They want power and they mean it. They're like villains out of Atlas Shrugged.
We're not Boy Scouts.
Yeah. It was like Victor Davis Hanson put it, this isn't your father's leftist revolution. Like Floyd Ferris says it in Atlas Shrugged, right? We're after power and we mean it. And that's who these guys are today. The Bernie Sanders mentality that dominates the left. Anything, blackmail, any kind of coercion. I wouldn't put murder past them. I don't know all these people who were close to the Clintons who ended up dying under mysterious circumstances. I don't have any evidence, so I can't point a finger. But if any evidence ever surfaces about those two, I'm not going to be surprised.
Well, you're right. I mean, the left's righteousness has led them to be unprincipled. I've gotten to the point of saying, what's one moral principle you hold, maybe besides murder, and you're right, maybe not even that one, but that you'd want to see someone in your own party prosecuted for? It's clearly not corruption or sexual assault or even basic political tolerance after the Biden election. But yeah, I mean, what's it going to take for murder to jump over?
Yeah. When somebody is, just an inveterate power luster, as the leftists very clearly are, then there's no moral principles that are non-negotiable, and they're extremely dangerous. You don't want to be caught in their crosshairs. You don't want to be somebody that was a target.
Even the Jeffrey Epstein didn't kill himself. It's like the Clintons almost like that there's this ambiguous suspicion that they'd be capable of such a thing.
Yeah, well, it certainly make people leery to stand up against them, won't it?
That's why it's used.
Clinton is the Putin of America.
Who's the Putin?
Clinton.
Oh yeah. I agree. I do not think that that any crime is beyond those two. And like I said, if any evidence ever surfaces that they were involved in that Epstein was murdered and they were involved in it, or any of these other people died mysteriously, were murdered and they were involved in it, Vince Foster going all the way back to him in the 90s, I won't be surprised.
I don't know why, they told the guards that there'd be a slap on the wrist, they wouldn't go to jail, and that's what happened. And
yeah. Yes, sir. Well, Epstein obviously knew too much. He was a real dirtbag, and he was involved with a lot of other dirtbags, and the biggest dirtbag of all is Bill Clinton. So I'm sure he had all kinds of if he went to trial, God knows what would have come out at his trial. So I could see why powerful people would want to silence him. And who's the biggest dirtbag of all? Well, Bill Clinton for sure.
I think they changed the nature of politics in the 90s, where it just the politics of personal destruction and selling out to the Chinese while saying there's no controlling legal authority like Gore did.
No, it was when Bill Clinton lied to our faces about Monica Lewinsky
that didn't help.
and then didn't resign. It's like he just got caught in a bold-faced lie. Horrible situation. He should have resigned.
He rallied the media around him.
Yeah, and then his wife lied for him. It was just a circus. And I think that's one of the turning points in American politics, is when we just said, all right, you guys are just a bunch of liars. You're no good.
Anything goes.
Yeah.
Anything goes as long, there's pragmatism, right? That you mentioned before. Anything goes as long as it gets us to our end game, which, is his power and this fundamental, and Hillary, I think, was more of a Marxist than Bill. But this fundamental remaking of America in accordance with Marxist principles. There's the end game.
Yeah. Switch gears a little bit. Do we violate nature by not responding to incremental approaches to freedom? It's like the altruism of the rich who say we can afford it, or I'll pick up the tab, or, on an action level, we won't prosecute you for doing X. It's not that big of a violation of the law. But isn't it the culmination of those little unpaid debts with no judgment that now has kids thinking that, your property should go to them because you're an oppressor?
Yeah. I think that's absolutely true. I think we need to stand up for individual rights across the board. This is, one example of that was when Rudy Giuliani was elected mayor of New York City in 1993. He inherited a city with a very high crime rate. It was very high. And Giuliani installed William Bratton as his police commissioner, and they started arresting. Giuliani and Bratton had this funny idea that crime is caused by criminals, not by poverty, as so that you end crime by incarcerating criminals. And so they started, a lot of those little crimes that you were just talking about, that prior to Giuliani's administration, they just let these guys go, jumping the turnstiles to get on the subway. So I'm glad they weren't doing that when I was a kid, because I would have been arrested for jumping the turnstiles. But jumping the turnstiles, all kinds of minor harassment, verbal harassment.
The squeegee guys.
yeah, they'd arrest them and they'd book them, and so they'd have their fingerprints, on file. And that was, that enabled them to, to later on crack down, to identify the criminals who perpetrated real crimes. They instituted stop, question, and frisk, and that stop and frisk is a misnomer. It's stop, question, and frisk, and that questioning of suspicious looking characters often led to the arrest, of some violent criminals on legitimate grounds. They got a lot of bad guys off the street, let's put it that way. And they brought New York City's crime rate down from amongst the highest in the country to the lowest of any city with 1 million people or more. New York City had the lowest crime rate of any large city in the country. And then part of that, a big part of that, was cracking down on the smaller crimes, on incremental crimes, cracking down on that, having a no tolerance policy towards criminals. And I stand up for individual rights. And the people who really benefited from that, of course, were minorities. Heather McDonald, maybe the leading crime expert in the country, estimated, I think it was 10,000. She thought 10,000, minority, mostly males, who would have been murdered if the crime rate continued at the rate it was prior to Giuliani. Their lives were saved by Giuliani's policies. Have cops just everywhere in the projects, and it brought down the homicide rate dramatically.
Yeah, there's there's different motives, the people living in there versus the white liberals that claim to be advocating for them in their own latte way.
Latte way, yeah. That's why I published an essay published an essay, which I think is important. And I'm getting together a collection of my essays to publish as a book. And leftist supremacy, not white supremacy, is the gravest threat to Black lives. I'm definitely going to include that essay. And, you know, it was interesting. In last summer, during the height of the George Floyd riots, the Gallup poll amongst Black Americans was like 81% of Black Americans favored as much or more policing than currently. Because, you know, if they're living you know, obviously there's a whole middle class of Black Americans and an upper class, but if you're living in the, you know, in the poverty sections and in the projects with the thugs, you know, you're an honest person. You know, you know the cops are the enemy. The thugs are the enemy. Would Thomas Sowell say that today in the housing projects, young parents will often put their children to bed in bathtubs to protect them from stray bullets that come smashing in through the windows? I mean, that's not the cops.
So Andrew, I just read your book, Heroes, Legends, and Champions, and I really liked it. I liked your approach of taking you know, a more conceptual, in-depth look at the concept of hero and trying to define it. And maybe you could give your overview of your book and give us the definition you came up with.
Yeah, well, thank you. William, I appreciate that. Yeah, the approach to Heroes, Legends, Champions, why heroism matters. I took a very inductive approach. You know, I wanted to show I want to tie the concept of hero to reality and showed that there were, you know, different people. I use a fictional example like Shane, real life examples like Ernest Shackleton, Maria Montessori, George Washington Carver, that there are people who face daunting obstacles, you know, in order to support life promoting goals, you know, goals of that objectively promote human life. And then there's other people, you know, who are honest and they go about, you know, their everyday business. They're, you know, every man and every woman. And then there are other people who are criminals, you know, violent criminals and murderers. It's a whole, you know, bunch of different kinds of people, in reality. And then so, well, you know, Ayn Rand taught us that we form concepts by integrating and differentiating. And so we integrate the people who achieve life promoting goals in the teeth of, you know, of obstacles that would dismay lesser men or women. You know, we differentiate that from every man and every woman who are honest, but don't reach some, you know, exalted goal in life. Certainly differentiate that from bad guys, you know, from criminals. And, you know, we could we need a concept, you know, to name these great achievers of, you know, of life promoting purposes. And it's because of those people we need the concept of hero. And so a hero, I don't remember my exact definition or offhand. It was complicated, but there's just okay. Well, thank you. Let's just give the salient characteristics. You know, that heroes, certainly I think these heroes that we originally, on the basis of which we originally formed the concept, certainly they generally have prowess or ability, whether it's intellectual or bodily or some combination of the two, that, you know, exceeds that of every man and every woman. They stand up for life promoting goals. They face and overcome daunting obstacles. The key point about heroes is a moral one. They work or fight in service of human life, to promote human life, not to destroy or harm it. And they do so with the courage to face daunting obstacles and/or antagonism, and with sufficient prowess, sufficient ability to stand up on equal terms or better, exceeding the abilities of the characteristics, the traits, or the abilities of any obstacles or antagonists. So what was the written definition?
Yeah, so the definition you gave, and this is the amended one you gave, is a morally upright individual who, with ability and dauntlessness equal to the task, confronts the obstacles and/or dangers arising in pursuit of significant life-advancing goals, and who triumphs in at least a moral sense.
You know, that's long. You know, that's long for a
Yeah.
definition, but I do think it's accurate. at the very least as a description of heroes. And I think it's important, as William, especially today in an era where intellectual culture is dominated by a preference for anti-heroes, and the idea that human beings can't be good, we can't be great, we're all basically flawed, and that in such a culture, I think we need to admire heroes all the more. I think we need to, a rational form of hero worship, which is a big part of the book. Why hero worship, properly understood, is a very positive phenomenon in human life, and I think we need a lot more of it. Which is, one of the purposes of the book is to stimulate more interest in and discussion of heroes. In the 19th century, there was a very vigorous debate about the nature of heroes, by hero worshippers, by people who would acknowledge heroes and admire them. It was a very vigorous discussion and debate amongst, top level thinkers: Friedrich Nietzsche, Herbert Spencer, William James, Thomas Carlyle. Not quite at that level, but still, he was a serious writer, and there was a deep appreciation of a discussion of heroes, and we've lost that for the most part. And we need to revitalize. I want to revitalize that discussion, of what heroes are, who they are, and why they should be admired in hero worship. So that's the purpose of the book.
Well, yeah, I liked it, and I'm kind of a language nerd. I took philology in college, and so I'd like to drill down into your definition a little bit, just a little bit.
Sure.
So I think your genus is a morally upright individual. Is that right?
Yes.
And I'm curious how you came up with that phrasing, and do you think it'd be accurate to also refer to it as like just a virtuous individual?
Yeah, I think those. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're a little faint there, but I can hear you.
Well, I was standing in front of the mic. I just sat down for a minute. So let me get back and stand up here. But yeah, I think those are roughly synonymous. Virtuous, morally upright. Virtuous, and I think virtuous could be used there. To me, as a connotation, just smacked a little too much of religion, and that virtue was, like sexual abstinence was a major part of virtue. I like morally upright better, although I think virtuous will work there. And I think that is, the genus, that there are a lot of morally good people in the world. I think most people are basically good and rational and want to live and want to do well by their children, and so on. But they're not. Most of them aren't heroes. So I think the heroes are a subcategory of the morally upright or the virtuous.
And the rest of it is, he confronts the obstacles and or dangers arising in the pursuit of significant life advancing goals. I take that, as a differentiator, and I'm wondering, do you think it's important to include an idea that a hero fights a villain, or is it enough to say a hero just conquers these obstacles? The obstacles could be anything from, just a storm, like you mentioned, Shackleton fighting the nature,
right.
And versus a hero who, like a Hercules, who has to fight people.
Yeah, I think there would. I don't think a hero necessarily requires antagonism. There are definitely obstacles and impediments. Shackleton himself put it nicely that obstacles are just things to be overcome. So one of the examples I used in the book was Edison. Now Edison had antagonists, Westinghouse and Tesla. Oh, and they were right in that case, and he was wrong. But if we use the electric light bulb and electric light system as an example, he had a lot of supporters, a lot of people who admired him, but he was dealing with the recondite nature of nature, that the sheer difficulty of inventing a commercially viable incandescent light, and the enormous amount of time and energy went into that experimentation, which Ayn Rand shows a version in Atlas when she talks about Reardon's 10-year struggle to develop Reardon metal. He wasn't going against his family was certainly standing in his way, but the looters weren't standing in his way yet. But it was just the real difficult problems of dealing with nature in this case, the terrible problems, the impediment the obstacles doesn't necessarily involve antagonism. I think that's heroic. That sheer perseverance at that level is heroic. Now it becomes even more so when you throw in antagonism as well as simply daunting obstacles. But either or. It can be one or the other or both, but whatever it is, whether it's an obstacle or it's an antagonist or both, the hero's undaunted. He's not necessarily fearless. I think fearless is irrational. When it was a Memorial Day a few weeks ago, and then the anniversary of D-Day shortly after that, these guys charging the shore, on Omaha Beach against withering machine gun fire. If they weren't afraid, yeah, they were crazy. Because a guy could get hurt out there.
They were afraid.
Yeah, I have to be afraid. Be terrified. It's terrifying.
I think that's portrayed pretty well in Saving Private Ryan, where they're just fearing going onto the beach.
Sure, and I would think that's accurate. I would certainly be terrified. But standing up and doing what I know is right, even when I'm scared, I'm afraid. I don't, that's courage. There's an old John Wayne Western, I don't remember which one, where he says, what's his definition of courage? He says, courage is being scared to death and saddling up anyway.
Right.
He says that's classic Duke from old school Hollywood. But the hero's undaunted. He's not necessarily unafraid, but he's undaunted in the face of these kinds of obstacles and or dangers that confront him in his quest for substantial life advancing goals. He's going to do it.
I tend to be a little more suspicious of those saying they're not afraid. That sometimes that's a deflection or insecurity.
Yeah, they're either lying or they're crazy. Hopefully they're just lying. If they're telling the truth in a situation like that, they're crazy.
Yeah, I'm not always sure which is worse. I'm curious, and I thank you so much for joining us. But Maslow spoke about hero worship and kind of seeing these personal people that he admired, and that inspired him to kind of come up with the whole self-actualization and hierarchy. And I'm just curious if you heard any of that, because it just reminded me of that when you were talking about how you came up with the book.
Well, I studied Maslow a little bit in psych classes,
Sure.
in college, but it's not my field. But I admire Maslow, and I think he's very good. And of course,
he references Rand.
Oh, does he? I didn't even know that.
Yeah, in Motivation and Personality.
I did not know that. I could see the influence of Aristotle there in a very rational way when he talks about self-actualization. I could see the very healthy influence of Aristotle's ethics. So little I know about Maslow, I certainly respect what he has to say.
Sure. Well, that is great. I know these 2.5 hours flew by. We probably could have done a lot more with you. Maybe we'll have you back eventually as things unroll and we're fighting these fights in the future. But I really just want to thank you for joining us, and just thank you for being a voice out there just that's not doing the whole moral equivalence thing, and that is identifying where the threats are coming from. It means a lot. You may not always hear it. You may just hear the bad email, but it honestly, it makes you a hero to me.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you, Scott and William. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on the show. I had a great time. And in the future, like you said, if you want me to come back on, I'm very happy to do so. And by the way, you reminded me, since standing up against the left, very possible I'm going to get canceled, from college, teaching college classes. Do you mind if I plug my Patreon account for a few seconds?
Please do.
Yeah, thank you. For anybody who values, we're egoists, so we're not going to ask anybody to make a sacrifice. But if somebody values the work that I do, you both the positive work, in discussing out, Ayn Rand's characters in Atlas Shrugged, or writing the book on education, or the polemical work is standing up against the left. If you value that, if you think that's important today, and you could afford, it's not a sacrifice for you, and you could afford even $5 a month, you just go up on patreon.com, patreon.com. And if you contribute to my Patreon account, I'd appreciate that very much, especially since it's very possible that cancel culture is gonna get me sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. Fighters deserve support.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much for coming on the show, Andrew. And just want to tell you, I read your fiction as well, and I recommend your fiction. I read The Heart of a Pagan. I thought it was really great. And I know you have a newer one, Dearth of Eagles, which I'm going to order pretty soon. And
Yeah,
I look forward to your other books.
Thank you, William. And let me just say, we announced yesterday that the Psychology of Atlas Shrugged characters, that the video series that Shoshana Milgram and Ellen Kane and I have done for the Ayn Rand Center UK, we have a verbal agreement with Hamilton Books now to publish that, in book form.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so get more Ayn Rand, more Atlas Shrugged out there into the culture. Can only do good. Can't do harm, right? Can only do good.
Absolutely. Well, good. Thank you again. This has been the Ayn Rand Fan Club, and we will see you again next week.